Thanks very much. Well, it's good to be able to respond briefly to this paper. And the first thing I want to say is how delighted I am that the Cambridge Papers, which I've been subscribing to for a very long time, I mean, maybe, I don't know, it might even go back to the beginning, whenever that was. I certainly have an enormous file of them at home. It's great that we have a Cambridge paper on this issue. Something that I think hasn't received the attention that it should have. So thank you very much for that. Secondly, it's great to have Dave writing it and a Rocha, co-sponsoring this evening and involved. When I worked in the international development sector, there's quite a lot of Christian organisations, Christian Aid, Tear Fund, World Vision, CAFOD, as well as many others, although I work for a secular one, Oxfam. When you get into the environmental arena, there's a Rocha, and then you sort of rapidly start running out. And I think that puts a huge importance on all that a Rocha does. Not that I necessarily think we want lots of competition to a Rocha, but it would be great to see more Christian engagement with this issue with a Rocha. Now, in terms of responding to the paper itself, I had a bit of difficulty with this, but mainly because I sort of agree with it. Well, with most, if not all of it at least. And so that was the first sort of challenge. And let me give you a couple of examples, with one little twist on one of them. For example, I think the way Dave brings out this issue of the Hebraic tradition and perspective on the world and worldview and framework, and contrasts this a bit with some of the presuppositions of Greek philosophy, is hugely important and insightful. I think that would be true actually quite a number of theological areas. I have to say that did then lead me to be slightly surprised that the headline quote from Jonathan Bailey is about, do species have a right to survive, or do we have a right to drive? And suddenly we're into deciding that the way we must think about this is in terms of rights. I'm not sure that is a terribly Hebraic way of thinking about the world. It might have some very good things to be said about it, but I don't think it's quite rooted in the Hebraic traditions. So that's a little challenge to the paper. Secondly, I really loved your idea that the image of God, that humans being created in the image of God, or as Dave I think is pushing us, creation expressing the image of God, particularly in humans, that is more of a job description than anything else. I love that. Now that may just be because I work in a world where I have a job description and my colleagues have job descriptions and so on. But now I just want to think about, if you'll allow me, if I didn't know about these Skype calls, but if I had been on those Skype calls, what would I have been saying? This paper could have been even further improved in the following ways. Firstly, I would have liked to see more about Jesus. I think if we're going to have a Christian reflection, Jesus needs to be at the heart of that. Of course, Jesus is there in the New Testament and indeed in the Old Testament and so on. But how about a bit more engaging with Jesus first and more? Secondly, I was a bit surprised actually that you didn't make more of the Noah story. I think particularly because this is not just about the Bible and environmental concern, but about biodiversity, and the Noah story does seem to me to speak very much to that. And I think it's amazing how many sermons you can hear, or talks, or Bible readings, whatever, about the Noah story that don't mention biodiversity and sort of species extinction. So it's sort of mind-boggling, because isn't that a rather big part of the story? I mean, why not? He could have had a rowing boat for a few people, but he was told to make an ark. So I thought we could have a bit more on that. Thirdly, as Dave acknowledged, I have to say this evening, I did think the conclusions went a bit further than the paper. I mean, as he said, I agree with the conclusions generally, but I didn't think they were all sort of entirely an expression of the argument in the paper. And that's probably because he wasn't allowed long enough or enough, say, or whatever, to do that. But I have some sympathy with that. Fourthly, value. And this question of is the value of nature, the value of creation, to be thought of in terms of its value to humans? And I think that could have been explored a bit further. Now, I would understand why not, but the reason it would be interesting to do so is that is a very live debate. Not just in the conservation community. I mean, this is a live debate, even, whisper it quietly, in the Treasury, where the Natural Capital Committee has its home and is busy working on this. So it would have been very interesting, at least for someone in this sort of world, to hear a bit more about what does that look like. Because on the one hand, economic decisions with environmental and species consequences are going to be taken, and if we don't have something to say into those decisions, they're going to be taken without whatever we think we might contribute. And on the other hand, by saying, yes, there is an economic dimension to biodiversity, are we capitulating to the view that in the end, it all comes down to money? And that's all that really matters. So we're sort of faced with this irrelevance versus capitulation tension, as I would put it. And then finally, I would have thought it was interesting to explore, because I'm still grappling myself with the why is this? Why is there not very much about this in Jesus and the New Testament and church history and tradition? I mean, Dave quite rightly brings out there is quite a lot, and there's certainly a lot more than many Christian traditions have acknowledged. But I would want to acknowledge there isn't a great deal. Why? I have two theories which I'll just mention. And one is the facts have changed, and this wasn't such a crucial issue then and through church history. And secondly, at least in quite a lot of the parts of church history tradition that I feel most sense of identification with, Christians were suffering a lot of persecution. And if you're under severe persecution, it's a bit difficult to do theological reflection on the future of the planet. So maybe that has something to do with it as well. Anyway, those are some things I would have been saying on those Skype calls if I'd had the chance, but they didn't let me in, but at least they've let me now. Thank you very much.